Hello, everyone. This is Moderate Rebels. I'm Ben Norton, joined by my co-host Max Blumenthal. And today we're talking about the recent election in Mexico. We've done a few episodes on Mexico with friend of the show, John Ackerman, talking about the situation with the progressive president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, known as AMLO, AMLO, and his new center-left party, Morena, which broke the bipartisan dictatorship in Mexico of the pre-party and the PAN party. We'll talk about all of that today. And we're also going to talk about the election results. There was just an election, important federal elections for the Congress and for the governorships. And the alliance led by the Morena party of AMLO, also including the Workers' Party and the Green Party. This is a kind of center-left, left-wing alliance. It won slightly over 50% of the seats in the Congress. So we're going to talk today about the situation, especially in light of the insane propaganda we've seen in the media, with magazines like The Economist freaking out, also other major media outlets in both the United States and in Latin America freaking out, claiming that AMLO is a wannabe socialist dictator. I mean, it's incredible. I mean, this is a center-left progressive president, certainly not a socialist, but they're treating him as if he's the reincarnation of Fidel Castro. So to discuss that today, we're joined by a Mexican freelance journalist, friend of the show, really good reporter. You should check him out and follow him on Twitter, José Luis Granados Ceja. He's also a staff writer for Venezuela Analysis, our friends over there, which is another excellent website focusing on Venezuela and also focusing in general on U.S. imperialism in Latin America. José Luis is joining us from Mexico City. So, José Luis, can you just, introduce yourself here, and then do you want to just talk about what the situation has been like in the past few weeks for you living there in Mexico City with all of the propaganda? What is the situation like on the ground, and what were the elections like?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's really, really good to be here. I'm a big fan of the show and all the work that Grayzone is doing. I think it's important to have these anti-imperialist voices actually being able to penetrate into the mainstream and reach audiences that perhaps wouldn't be exposed to this, because it's essential. I think it's the duty of people living inside of the United States and other imperialist countries to understand the situation and how these countries are truly imposing their will on countries like ours, countries like Mexico that are fighting still to be free. So my name is José Luis Granados Ceja, freelance journalist. As you mentioned, I work with Venezuela Analysis, but I also work for different other progressive outlets in the United States as a freelance journalist, and I'm a committed anti-imperialist. It's something that I put forth first and foremost in my bio, because I think it's important to really put it out there and so that the world understands that this is something that is legitimate to name and to denounce. So what was it like being a journalist in Mexico City? It's interesting because it's kind of like New York City when it comes to media in Mexico. It is the heart of media, and it's where you see the concentration of the misinformation campaign. Like so many other elections in Latin America, this was an election that was very much informed by a dirty campaign that the media played a pretty large role and actually had some consequence. But when I'm talking about the election, the first thing I want to say is always López Obrador, López Obradorismo, Morena, and its allied parties won the election. And I say that first and foremost because I think if you followed any of the coverage, you would think that they lost. And that's all framed in this way that they didn't achieve a supermajority. And a supermajority that would have given the ability to change the Constitution without consulting other parties. Obviously, it's a little bit more technical than that. You always have to negotiate. You also have to pass it by the state level legislature. It's not so easy as simply winning a supermajority. But even then, it was never on the table. That was not a possibility. That was not part of the scenario for these elections. Nonetheless, this was the narrative. And this is the narrative that they had established actually before the results even came in. They knew that if they did get the results that they wanted, that this was the line they were going to try to spin. And as we saw, the international media outlets like the New York Times, the Washington Post, they ate it up. They totally bought it as to suggest that a midterm election, which we know in Mexico, in the United States, in Canada, they're always a test of the sitting party in power. It's always a referendum on them, and often they're punished. But in this the most important question was who's going to control the lower house of the Mexican Congress, La Cámara de Diputados, the Chamber of Deputies, because that's who controls the public budget. That's who sets the priorities for the next 3 years, the remaining 3 years of López Obrador's term. And Morena won. Morena and its allied parties won. That means that the opposition parties, that old regime that you mentioned that we here in Mexico call the PRIAN, are not going to be able to dig their claws into the budget, are not going to be able to impede the priorities of the government, and that alone makes it an important victory. And beyond that, they also expanded a territorial reach. There was 15 governorships that were up for election in these recent elections, these mega elections where there were thousands of posts being considered. Morena won in 11 of them, and in states where the left was relatively weak. So now you have this relatively young party that burst onto the scene, that achieved the federal government in 2018, now having representation in all parts of the territory, which I think is going to be really significant when it comes to the next elections in 2024, right? So now you're going to have more Morena representation in these areas where perhaps there wasn't before. And you also have the situation where there's a bit of a decentralization of the left. You know, Mexico City is seen as the bastion of the left. Of course, it's where López Obrador served as jefe de gobierno, which is equivalent to being the governor of Mexico City, it being such a large place, holding a special place inside of the Mexican political constitution. And this result means that there's going to be more expressions, different expressions from different parts of the country that will hopefully help inform what the party is going to do. But there is an important caveat there. There was we should call it a defeat of the left inside of Mexico City. And we can get into that, and I hope we can talk a little bit more detail about why that happened. A lot of people are saying, oh, this is a historical realignment of Mexico City, which has voted left since 1997. That's simply not true. That's not what happened. But I do think it is something that the party leadership needs to take into consideration, and something that also where the media played a big role. You know, I started this response by going into the fact that this is kind of like the New York of Mexico when it comes to the media saturation. It had an effect. It really did. You know, people here tend to have more access to mainstream media outlets, you know, and that means that it served to change the opinion of a lot of voters, which produced the result that we saw here in the capital of the country.
We in the United States heard, as you mentioned, a very similar message about Amlo as many Mexicans who watch corporate media and local corporate media, local right-wing media would have also heard, which is that he's moving Mexico toward a dictatorship. I see you on Twitter kind of sniping at someone named Jan Albert Hutzen, who is the Mexico representative from the Committee to Protect Journalists, which is like this billionaire-backed press freedom group. And, you know, Hutzen I don't know, maybe he is Mexican. It doesn't sound like a Mexican name. Maybe he's, I don't know if his family's from there or something, but he's really lecturing Mexico on what it can do with these NGOs, which are reaping millions of dollars through the National Endowment for Democracy to make all these corruption allegations. We've seen this story before. I was actually just on a Nicaraguan TV station talking about that government's attempt to combat all of these millions of dollars flowing into NGOs there to promote regime change. But I think it's important to kind of start at an elemental place here for our US-based audience that's been getting this message from The Economist or The Washington Post, or even from some sectors of like respectable left media, that Amlo is a dictator in waiting. And or we can talk about the leftist critique later, but this attack on him from the U.S., from the NGO sector, and in the media, what is so wrong about what AMLO's doing in the eyes of Washington, and how does that highlight his agenda going forward after this election?
Yeah, I think if López Obrador wasn't a leftist, they would be singing his praises. And, you know, Ackerman actually made this argument in one of the pieces way back before the 2018 election. You know, this is a man who has engaged in grassroots struggle, has been a pillar of a voice of people on the streets, of standing up for issues that are widely supported by the Mexican population, like energy sovereignty, about access to healthcare for the poor, about support, putting, like he always says, los pobres primero, putting the poor first. And yet he's vilified. And it's because he's a leftist, because he threatens U.S. interests, because he has a nationalist progressive policy. I always talk about his energy policy as an example. He's trying to rescue the state oil company and the state electricity company. That is something that affects U.S. capital. And so when U.S. capital responds in kind and starts to vilify him. And he has always been an ardent defender of the natural resources that are in the country should go to benefit the poorest in the country. It's not a radical idea whatsoever. It's an idea that is actually probably one of the most consistent things when we look at the pink tide, the leftist governments of Latin America. It's an idea that should be widely accepted. It's one that I think if we had a more honest media environment in the United States, it's something that would probably also be majority approved inside of the United States as well. But as you mentioned, there's also, the many-headed hydra, the many tentacles, whatever, analogy you want to use, of the interest of, the U.S. ruling class and U.S. capital, is also through using organizations like the USAID to fund things like Mexicanos contra la Corrupción y la Impunidad, which is this, this NGO that bills itself as a space that denounces corruption, that does investigative reporting, but receives something of like 20% of its funding from the United States, and it does so in a way and then uses that funding to promote partisan interests. And that's where we get into a problem. That's where it's very clearly foreign interference and something that needs to be resisted. And it's something that was pointed out by an important article that I believe Grayzone covered, where they pointed out that this was an issue for the Amlo administration. And they even sent a diplomatic note to the United States saying, this is not okay with us. But the point is that who's behind Mexicanos contra la Corrupción y la Impunidad? It's this gentleman named Claudio X González. Claudio X González is kind of the typecast of these agents that act in favor of U.S. imperialism because they are wedded to the interests of international capital. He was the head of Kimberly-Clark in Mexico. And he was the man who was largely responsible for pushing forward what we called here in Mexico the unholy alliance, where you had the PRI, the PAN, and the PRD running together, parties that historically, were said to be adversaries together, running on a joint ticket to try to stop Morena from achieving its majority in the Congress. It was him and the Coparmex, which is Gustavo de Hoyos, from another business leader from Mexico. And they deliberately use the influence that they have with these spaces, the funding that they receive from abroad, to try to influence the national political scene. That's not acceptable. It's something that obviously provokes a response from the progressive community inside of Mexico. But of course, then you have, figures like the CPJ who say, no, these are just journalists and this is an attack on journalism. And the truth is that anybody who is even remotely familiar with the way that U.S. imperialism, through things like the USAID, try to interfere and lay the groundwork. And that's one thing that hopefully, again, we can get into this a little bit later, is that's what we probably should expect to see a lot more of in the coming months and years. Because they weren't able to use the elections to achieve their aims, that doesn't mean they're going to give up. We know this, we've seen it 100 times. They're going to start to increase this kind of dirty campaign, this kind of manipulation behind the scenes, and trying to use the power that foreign money can give you to try to show the seeds of instability and try to affect the actual ability of López Obrador and whoever succeeds him from being able to govern.
Yeah, and on that note, you mentioned Claudio X González in this group, which is called, ironically, Mexicans Against Corruption and Impunity, although it's led by corrupt so-called business leaders. I mean, oligarchs. We're talking about multimillionaire oligarchs. You mentioned that it's run by Claudio X González, and that his father was the head of this company, the Mexican branch of Kimberly-Clark. that name Kimberly Clark is not really that well known in the United States or in many parts of the world, but their brands are really well known. So
Can I just deploy a little factoid? It's the
I just want to mention that Kimberly Clark, this company owns the brands Kleenex, Huggies, Scott, Kotex. I mean, we're talking pull-ups. So we're talking about like huge, like we're talking about Kleenex, diapers, and female sanitation products. Like this is a massive company, and this NGO that's run by this oligarch that's funded by the United States, Mexicans Against Corruption and Impunity. His father was the head of this massive company in Mexico. Like we're talking about oligarchs.
Well, this company is owned by the Sensenbrenner family, or Representative Jim Sensenbrenner, who was in the Congress in the U.S. From a right-wing district in, I believe, Illinois, is the heir to the Kimberly Clark fortune. And he was the author of 4437, which was the signal anti-immigrant bill. They called it the Border Protection Bill, that was going to authorize the deportation of anyone who is in the country illegally. It really set it was kind of laying the groundwork for Trump's agenda and putting ICE on steroids. And it spurred the largest immigrant protests, and some of the largest protests the United States has ever seen in, I think it was 2005. So there's a certain irony there.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing that I wanted to stress is that, so the symbolism of Claudia X Gonzalez is important to understand the interests he represents, right? In terms of these Mexican oligarchs who never paid taxes under the neoliberal regimes of the PRIAN. And I want to talk more about that after. The neoliberal centrist party, the PRI, and the right-wing PAN party, which dominated Mexican politics for 7 or 8 decades. But getting back to this so-called business leader, this oligarch Claudia X Gonzalez, another important point is that he is a leader also of the Mexican equivalent of the Chamber of Commerce, which has been one of the main forces leading opposition against AMLO. His father who has the same name, his father was on the board, one of the key leaders of the Mexican equivalent of the Chamber of Commerce, this massive business lobby. And in our past interviews, if people listening are interested, John Ackerman mentioned that, there certainly are left-wing critiques of AMLO, as there is with any president, of course. But, there's often like this kind of ultra-left tendency in the United States to criticize AMLO, claiming that because he's not expropriating capital and he's not expropriating the wealth of the Mexican oligarchy, that he's supposedly not a real leftist in all of this discourse. But if you look at the main institutional forces funding the opposition to him, I mean, there's, of course, the United States through CIA fronts like the National Endowment for Democracy and USAID, both of which fund Mexicans Against Corruption and Impunity and Claudia X Gonzalez. But also it is this oligarchy. And the oligarchy in Mexico, like in Brazil, these other massive countries in Latin America, they have a lot of power. So I'm wondering if you could just talk more about the oligarchy and its opposition to AMLO.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned taxes in the context of this question, because one of the left critiques that's been made of López Obrador is, why hasn't he raised taxes? Why isn't he trying to tax the rich? And it's been a very interesting strategy that he's employed. So instead of trying to tax the rich, what he's done is made them pay the taxes they're supposed to be paying all these years. Literally decades of taxes that were forgiven by the tax authority in Mexico. He's like, no, it's time to pay. And that's actually what's given him the financial maneuver, the space to maneuver, to be able to keep taxes low, try to keep at bay some of the criticisms from that very same business sector. Oh, you're going to scare away investment, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, it provokes their ire. And, I believe it was Gustavo de Hoyos who was caught saying, fine, we'll pay these taxes, but we're going to try to vote you out of power as soon as we get. So it shows you that, of course, they're class interests. They that's one of the things too that what I use to respond to people who say that, oh, he's not leftist enough. As a Mexican, as someone who was forced to migrate away because of the economic challenges, and I made the decision to come back to try to do my bit here to try to inform to the English-speaking world about what's happening in the country. It's wild to see the difference between a government that actually puts the population's interest first. I mean, that alone is a marked difference in this and previous governments. Governments from let's talk about the democratic era. Vicente Fox, Felipe Calderón, Enrique Peña Nieto, they ruled on behalf of the oligarchs, they ruled on behalf of the national bourgeoisie and in favor of the international bourgeoisie. Always, consistently, right? When they had to evaluate what decision to make, it was always in eyes of how does this benefit the people who keep me in power, which is the oligarchs. And so this is the radical difference. So all those people that used to be able to pick up a phone and have a direct line to the Secretary of the Economy or to the Treasury no longer have that same kind of access, and it makes them feel like the country that they felt belonged to them is no longer theirs. And it never was. It's not theirs. It belongs to the great majorities of this country that say that we want investment in public infrastructure. We want these programs that to support the poorest among us. We want, more economic opportunities for the country's south. We have politicians who sadly won a post who actually was the PAN's candidate at one point, saying things like, if Mexico didn't need to deal with Guerrero, Chiapas, and Oaxaca, it would be a developed nation, right? Like that's the disrespect, the kind of desprecio, I'm not sure what the word is in English, for the country, the people who live in this country. And even if you look at some of the responses to what people have been saying as a result of the elections, especially here in Mexico City, the most virulent, crass, classist attitudes came out from the surface. The famous saying, scratch a liberal, find a fascist. And the so-called urban progressive liberals, who voted for the right-wing coalition, think that they have the moral high ground, but then the very next day start talking about how, that half of the country is the one that lives off social programs and that half of the city, is the one that pays taxes. It's absurd, right? If we actually look at the statistics, proportionally, who pays more taxes? It's the campesino. It's not the large oligarchs. And so that's why you see this attitude from them, and that's why they're so hell-bent on trying to damage his project and try to impede as much as possible. Things like actually putting in injunctions to try to stop projects like the Tren Maya, saying, it doesn't have the necessary approval, that we're going to go to a judge that we know is in our pocket and he's going to rule in favor of us. That kind of things. Is that democratic? Hardly.
Yeah, you just mentioned the Tren Maya, the Maya train. That was going to be my next question. I think it's something that our audience should probably know more about because we constantly hear from U.S. administrations either that they want to, build the wall, or in the case of this administration, they want to address migration at its root cause. And so Kamala Harris went to Guatemala and promised that like Microsoft and MasterCard would come down and like give Guatemalans gift cards or something. I mean, it's every solution is corporate. But AMLO has collaborated with Trump on some border initiatives. He had actually a pretty good relationship with Trump, surprisingly. And this Maya train does seem to address migration at its root cause. I've been to all the states that you mentioned, Guerrero, Chiapas, the southern states, which are very poor. I've been all around them. And I lived in LA for 5 years and got to know people who made it across the border and had settled there. And they're all leaving for the same reason, which is a disinvestment in the South and NAFTA and these free trade agreements and just multinational corporations basically destroying Mexico's rural economy and then sapping its middle class of any source of stability. So the Maya train, I mean, can you describe what it is? It's also, I should mention, it was presented in The Nation magazine by this writer, Dawn Paley, who you might have something to say about, as environmental catastrophe. She focused much of her critique on AMLO as an extractivist because of this infrastructure project. My understanding of it is it's a train, but it's also kind of like an ecotourism mini Belt and Road initiative that will provide more economic opportunities in these ignored southern regions, which have been the drivers of northern migration than ever before. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, you're absolutely right. I think it's important that we mention the free trade agreement, now the USMCA. It fundamentally remade the Mexican economy, but it provided nothing in alternative to these communities, and who since the mid 90s haven't really had economic opportunities available to them. So this project, it's controversial. Absolutely, right? There are people that are in favor of it. There are people that are opposed to it. There are big voices that are very critical of it. The first one that comes to mind is the EZLN, although it should be noted that the part that actually crosses Chiapas is not really the territory where the EZLN is most active, but we know that they have this position
That is
criticizing
the Zapatista movement.
The Zapatista movement, that's right, yes. They have this position of opposing these kinds of mega projects. But that aside, what the projects like the Corredor Transísmico, so the Trans-Isthmus Corridor, the Tren Maya, the Maya train, what they're historic investments in parts of the country that were basically abandoned for the last 30 years. And if you go to these communities, like you've mentioned, you've been to them, you see that these are very low income people who are looking for employment to be able to provide for their families, right? And these is one of the ways that can be done. And there's other initiatives. There's also the Sembrando Vida, which is about reforesting the country and providing economic incentives for people to participate in that. It's something that's actually been extended to the countries of Central America as well. If you're serious about meeting the root causes of migration, it's essentially that. People have to feel like there is an option of staying. I do a lot of work on Honduras as well. And the desperation of people from Central America is so great. I mean, nobody is willing to risk the journey if staying at home isn't more dangerous. And it's the same thing here in Mexico, right? And so there's been consultations with the communities that are going to be affected by these projects. Now, these same consultations have been criticized for not necessarily meeting the standards. I think it's something that needs to be looked into, right? Like, it's not hard. The people, if we go to these areas, we'll be able to go and talk and find out what is it they actually feel about it. But I don't think it's this narrative that's that's sold in articles like the one that John wrote, that, there's widespread opposition, it's an environmental catastrophe, that this is just on a whim of the president who wants to have a legacy project. I think that's a really bad faith argument. I think it's one that doesn't actually respect the autonomy of these communities to also decide that they want these projects. And so the fact that the first effort to really try to bring something to these communities is met with this kind of draws suspicions from me anyway. It seems very suspect that, finally there is a initiative to try to deliver economic development to these areas, through, like you mentioned, it's an eco-tourist train. The Yucatan Peninsula is one that's heavily reliant on tourism that will hopefully be able to spur development, but also will facilitate the movement of goods so that agricultural producers who work in the area will be able to get their goods to market. Same with the Trans-Isthmus Corridor to help move products and generate economic activity. At the beginning of the program, we talked about this. These aren't socialist proposals, but they're nationalist progressive proposals that I do think count on the support of the majority of Mexicans.
Yeah, and I'm curious really quickly, and there's a lot we can say in response to that, but there's one angle that I'm interested in geopolitically, and that's the role of China. I do know that Chinese companies are helping to build the Maya train. They're also involved in other mega infrastructure projects that AMLO's undertaking, like the Dos Bocas refinery. Maybe you can refer to that, talk about that. But what's interesting is there's this website that's funded by this big foundation that is dedicated explicitly to China's development projects in Latin America and trying to portray them as all ecocidal, so bad for the environment. It's called Diálogo Chino, China Dialogue, and it has emphasized that AMLO's infrastructure projects involve Chinese companies. And of course, the implication is that China's Belt and Road Initiative, and in general, Chinese developmental projects in the global south, are all horrible for the environment. Of course, U.S. developmental projects, to the extent they exist, that's, those are great for the environment. I mean, it's very hypocritical, but what is the discussion in China, and what is the discussion you've seen in the media about China's role in these projects?
Yeah, there's the usual, fear mongering about China. We see just coming off of, the G7 that obviously that this is where, the Western powers are now going to be setting their sights. So any kind of cooperation with China is going to be seen as a threat. The thing with Mexico is that it's neighbors with the United States, right? Like that relationship isn't going to change overnight. It's not like other countries in Latin America, like Venezuela and Ecuador, that had a much greater opportunity to try to really strengthen ties with China. So I think it's a lot of noise for a lot of nothing, because at the end of the day, the U.S. is probably always going to be Mexico's #1 trading partner. I don't see that changing, this century. Nonetheless,
sorry to cut you off, but 60% of Mexico's GDP comes from trade with the United States and business with the U.S.
Yeah, exactly. So that's not going to change anytime soon. But it's interesting you mentioned outlets like Diálogo Chino. It's the role that international media outlets, English language outlets, play in trying to put forward this kind of narrative. Same thing happened actually just recently over the weekend with this New York Times article, which supposedly, was looking into the truth behind the collapse of the subway system based on experts looking at photographs from the scene. I mean, it's like, it really shouldn't pass the bar when it comes to journalistic practices, right? Like that's not good enough, right? That shouldn't have gone to print. But of course, inside of that article, what did they talk about? Oh, there's engineers that are also worried about, the building standards that are going into the Tren Maya. So it shows you that really insidious role that they play. And curiously enough, who's the person who just joined the New York Times Mexico bureau? It's the reporter who was just in Caracas for 7 years. So, it's not a coincidence. And the reason is because they might as well try.
Nick Casey?
No, it's Anton Kurbalov.
Oh, that guy.
Yeah.
He has like a Russian last name.
Yeah. I apologize.
Yeah. We have a piece on him at the Grayzone where we published a recording that of him giving an interview where he brags about using, in his words, sexy tricks to demonize the Venezuelan government. And even, outright fabrications. So,
Anatoly Kurmanayev is his name.
That's where, there we go.
So check out our piece if you're watching this, just to see the open dishonesty of the New York Times correspondent José Luis is referring to, and the timing is perfect for him to be sent to Mexico.
Yeah, but just to finish up on that, Mexico wants to have a better relationship with countries like China. It needs to diversify its trading partners. There are U.S. interests that are being affected. I talked a little bit about the energy sector. The energy sector is not happy with López Obrador because he is looking for energy sovereignty. We're not going to be buying gasoline from Texas refineries in the short-term future, hopefully. And so that also means that an increased export capacity means that, perhaps it'll be China, one of the customers. But it's also, Mexico is taking a global South perspective, something that was desperately needed. I've mentioned vaccines as an example. So Mexico, together with Argentina, is producing AstraZeneca. So Argentina makes the active component, and the final envase and the vials are made here in Mexico, and they've already started sending them out. I believe the first shipment went out to Paraguay and Bolivia. This global South perspective that we need to be having a closer relationship with the countries that are in our region and the countries that are strategic partners in the region, including countries like China.
Yeah, and really quickly, just for anyone who's watching, this is the article Max mentioned, Sexy Tricks, How Journalists Demonize Venezuela's Socialist Government in Their Own Words. And it just shows how this guy, Anatoly Kurmanayev, the New York Times former correspondent in Venezuela, who is now in Mexico, I mean, he called himself a mercenary. So it just shows these people, when we call them mercenaries, it's not even necessarily an insult, because some of them proudly call themselves mercenaries. And you can expect the same kind of tactics that he used in Venezuela against Mexico. I mean, I remember another article he wrote recently was trying to blame the Venezuelan government for the lack of birth control in Venezuela by claiming that the Chavistas were all anti-women misogynists who wanted to control women's bodies. And of course, he only mentioned like one time in passing that sanctions have made it difficult for Venezuela to buy birth control. So of course, the entire story is trying to blame the Chavistas while ignoring the fact that the government can't buy birth control because the sanctions are preventing it from getting medical supplies. I mean, so expect that same kind of propaganda now against AMLO.
If they sent him to Beijing, he would say there's too much birth control. That's the New York Times line there.
No, exactly.
But back to the lecture at hand. Kamala Harris, when she was in Guatemala, said, "Do not come, do not come." And that really, I mean, her voice. I mean, you know, if I hear that voice, I will not come. But she said what Obama had said, and I don't know if she said that to Willie Brown too or whatever. But back in the day, when but
oh god.
But yeah, I mean, come on. And then Biden had also said that, and he said that to Haitians on the U.S. Embassy in Haiti, tweeted, "Do not come." Hillary Clinton, I think, when she was Secretary of State, went to, was it Honduras? I think she went to Honduras and said, you know, "I just wrecked your country. Do not come to mine." I don't actually think they believe that. I don't actually think that the powers behind Democratic administrations and behind Republican administrations before Trump's administration, like the second Bush administration and the first one, I don't think they want people not to go north. I think they do. They want a steady stream of cheap labor that is non-unionized and completely vulnerable. And, you know, the more anti-immigrant laws that get passed in Arizona and all the states that make people put migrants more in the shadows, well, that's even better. It drives and depresses wages even further, and it depresses wages inside Mexico. So the local population cannot afford to buy anything from local producers. So the producers simply produce along an import-export model where they, you know, take the farm goods and send it abroad to be canned or whatever, send it to the US. It's a perfect model. The problem is that it creates a political problem for the Democrats. They're losing more and more white voters, older white people who don't want to see Spanish billboards in their neighborhoods or whatever that say abogado. That's like a direct threat to their psyche. And, you know, the border is a very unstable place, but it's not because of the migrants. It's actually because of the U.S. drug war and so on. But that's my point. And that really goes to why I think the U.S. is opposing these infrastructure problems in Mexico. Because if you didn't want migrants to come to the U.S. and you wanted them to stay home to avoid making a possibly deadly trip across the Sonoran Desert that they clearly don't want to make, but they risk death just for staying in their own community, then why wouldn't you throw all of your support to those infrastructure projects instead of directing USAID to fund these NGOs to demonize them? So I'll just put that comment forward. And my question relates to another aspect of AMLO's policies relating to getting more money out of Pemex, the national oil company. It was nationalized, I believe, in 1938 by Lázaro Cárdenas, who was sort of the like first democratic socialist type figure to serve in Mexico. That has also been attacked from the left as an extractivist project, or Don Paley said it's a thing of the past. But, you know, why wouldn't the U.S. support these projects if it wanted to reduce migration? And what hopes are there for funding social programs and providing more benefits and subsidies through rejuvenated Pemex?
Yeah, this message, "do not come," it's the one they've been using for the last 20 years. Of course it doesn't work. They know it doesn't work. You know, you can actually go onto the YouTube page of, you know, the Honduran embassy, and they have the same exact message. And it's, you know, a video that was uploaded 10 years ago. They know that this is a message that doesn't work. It's a message that was obviously, you know, designed for the domestic audience. Look how tough Kamala is, in front of the Guatemalan president. But actually, I think it was a misplay because it really provoked a lot of backlash amongst the progressive community inside the United States and certainly in Latin America. That made waves here as well. And I dare to say that I think it tempered her ability to try to puff her chest inside here in Mexico. You didn't see the same kind of press attention to her trip, much less comments, a lot more about, cooperation agreements that were signed. Statement was uploaded to the website and the U.S. government, and that was it. But to get to your point, yeah, I think they absolutely rely. So many businesses and entire U.S. policy is oriented around the suppression of wages as a result of irregular migration coming into the United States, especially in this moment. We're already seeing the signs of what that reconfiguration of the power and the negotiating power in particular of labor inside the United States is having. This whole nobody wants to work anymore that's going around. The reason is that people aren't going to work for those wages. And so what are they going to try to do? Absolutely. They're going to try to see if they can get, people with irregular immigration status to work those positions under the table for even less than the minimum wage that, U.S. politicians refuse to raise. And then to go back to the point about the investing in the country's, natural resources, the point that I say is that if you're not talking about the climate debt, then you're dishonest about your intentions about the planet. If you are only coming after López Obrador for trying to build a refinery, for building a train project that runs on diesel instead of electric, for wanting to increase transoceanic commerce, without talking about the fact that Mexico is a middle-income country. Mexico is a country that did not have the benefit of having colonies, that did not emerge into the international capitalist order in the same place that countries like France and Japan and the United Kingdom and the United States and Canada had. Then you're not being honest. I think that you need to talk about the fact that we have the right to development. We have the right to use these resources to put food on the table of the poorest in the country, which I remind everybody constitute a majority in this country. There is nothing wrong with that. And we've seen the success of that. We've actually seen what happens when you're too successful in Bolivia. Bolivia took that model and to excellence, showing what's possible when you recover your natural resources, so much so that they reverted to a classic military coup there to try to install a US-friendly regime. So that's, again, I mentioned this earlier, these kinds of projects affect US interests. And that's why you don't see the enthusiasm that logically should be there for them. Because, if they're successful, then people won't be migrating as much or at all. They'll, as the president always says, they'll migrate because they want to, not because they have to. And then they'll be able to stay in their communities, and have productive lives and be able to build a future for their children, and so until we see some serious commitment from, the developed countries, I'm not personally interested in this anti-extractivist crowd that actually doesn't have any answers for the poor majorities of Latin America.
Exactly. And when we're talking about these so-called left-wing critiques, which I would argue are actually often right-wing critiques of actually existing progressive and left-wing leaders in Latin America. Among the critiques we hear are these extractivist critiques, which are also levied against Rafael Correa in Ecuador, because Ecuador has large oil reserves. Also, of course, against the Chavistas in Chavez and Maduro in Venezuela. But there are a few other criticisms, and I want to just address...
Petropopulism.
Yeah, petropopulism. I mean, exactly. And by the way, you were talking earlier about this idea, this extremely revolutionary, radical idea that a country's natural resources should go to benefit the people who live in that country. I know, crazy idea. But this has been such a core element of U.S. foreign policy, is opposing that idea, which is sometimes referred to as resource nationalism. But there are two other kind of more sophisticated critiques that I want to go over really quickly. One, they're both very related. One is corruption. And I think this has become such a key part of the new strategy of the U.S. empire, especially among Democrats, Republicans are often more blatantly kind of neo-colonial. We saw the Trump administration declared Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua to be the troika of tyranny, openly backing coup attempts with Juan Guaido and all of that. But with Democrats, and especially under Obama, and now we saw them perfect the art of war of lawfare, legal warfare. So the Obama-Biden administration, as it's now frequently referred to, and cool, if they want to take credit for the coup in Honduras, the coup in Brazil, the coup in Paraguay, the war in Libya, the war in Syria, if Biden wants to take credit for that, cool. It's the Obama-Biden administration. Of course, people know about the lawfare against the Workers' Party in Brazil and the imprisonment of Lula, the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff. And then there was also a kind of legal coup against Fernando Lugo in Paraguay. But now we've also seen that the State Department, and especially the U.S. Agency for International Development, the CIA front, USAID, under Samantha Power, this liberal interventionist war hawk, they've really taken this idea of the fight against corruption under their wing as the kind of one of the new prevailing talking points to justify U.S. intervention, U.S. meddling. So I don't think it's not a coincidence that one of the main groups that the U.S. is funding in Mexico to destabilize AMLO is called Mexicans Against Corruption and Impunity. You know, this is a country that has suffered from systemic corruption as if Washington hasn't. In the United States, they just legalize corruption through Citizens United and other programs. They don't call it corruption. It's still corruption. But I mean, it is true that Mexico has suffered from systemic corruption for a long time. So it's a critique that falls, you know, on fertile soil on the left. People say that AMLO isn't doing enough to fight corruption, ignoring the fact that the U.S. State Department, the White House, just declared the fight against corruption to be a so-called national security priority, and that recently in a White House press conference, a high-level administration official was asked by an anonymous journalist. They were all anonymous, but the White House published this press release, and Brazil Wire found that one of the journalists that were handpicked by the White House, Biden does that too, by the way, not just Trump. One of the journalists asked, are U.S. intelligence agencies going to be involved in this fight against corruption in other countries? The journalist specifically asked for other countries, and the response of the top-level White House administration official was yes. He specifically said the CIA and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence are involved in this new effort to combat corruption around the world in other countries. So that's just giving the game away. The CIA is involved in lawfare against other countries. So, I mean, that's one part of it. I mean, I kind of gave my analysis of that already, but this also this plays into the other critique that we saw levied against AMLO, which we saw represented in this article in The Nation that Max mentioned by this writer, Don Paley, who's this U.S. academic who lives in Mexico, who also supported the coup at first in Bolivia. She was a harsh, extreme critic of Evo Morales, a so-called left critic, but I mean, just helping the right wing, portraying the movement towards socialism party as extractivist and anti-indigenous and blah, 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 all these ridiculous critiques. But one of her other critiques that we saw in The Nation was militarization. So those are the two. I mean, you mentioned extractivism. There's also corruption. And then there's militarization. The idea that AMLO is betraying the working class somehow because he's using the military to try to clamp down on violence, which is a serious problem. So, I mean, I addressed a lot of things there, but I'm wondering if you could just address this idea that, like,
we can just end the show now because
I don't know, but I mean, like, I just wanted to spell out that, like, this lawfare strategy is very clearly the Biden administration is setting the stage for this, and a lot of useful idiots on the so-called left are playing into this. But specifically with the question of militarization, I'm wondering if you can respond to that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, on the point on corruption and lawfare, it's interesting. Before lawfare kind of entered the mainstream, you know, one of the first victims of these kind of judicial attempts was López Obrador, back when he was jefe de gobierno, when they tried to stop him from being able to run for the presidency in 2006, which we should note he actually won, but was stolen in a fraud. They made up this excuse, something about a permit, about a street, to try to take away his political rights. So, you know, he's been there. It's not something that's And when I mentioned at the beginning of the show that there's probably going to be more of these kind of dirty tricks and these dirty campaigns, that's probably one of the ones we're going to see. We're going to see more injunctions, more use of the judicial system. That's why there's also a little bit of a battle happening right now inside the judicial power in Mexico about this reform that they want to put in to try to strengthen the judiciary. But obviously, there's a lot of members of the Supreme Court, of the Mexico Supreme Court, that were put there by the old regime. So it's, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Well, and then there was the whole scandal, if you want to explain, of Salvador Cienfuegos.
Yeah. It's a long story that maybe we don't have time for today. But I will say, in terms of corruption, the allegation that not enough is being done, I find pretty ludicrous on the surface. It's people who maybe didn't understand how Mexico operated before this government came into power. The allegation, because that's been proven in court, is that Odebrecht gave, bags full of money that was then distributed to legislators to pass the energy reform, to try to privatize, Mexico's energy sector. So, that's the kind of corruption that ends up dismantling national institutions like Pemex, and, progressive nationalists has to come in and fix the situation in order to do, as we said earlier, to try to redistribute the wealth through the state. But on this question of militarization, I mean, it's a difficult one because it's an inherited problem. Had the fraud that happened in 2006, we probably wouldn't be in this situation. Calderon launched that war because he didn't have legitimacy, because most of the public didn't view him as a legitimate president, and he put on his oversized coat that barely fit him, that didn't fit him, to try to show how what a tough guy he was, that he was in charge of the country, and we're still living with the consequences of that. The idea that it's a militarized approach, I think that the citizens of Mexico have the right to live in safety, and they are demanding action from the state to act against these organized crime, these irregular armed groups. I don't think that's illegitimate, and I think that that strategy needs to be played out. One really important thing that I think often gets cut out of deliberately so, of any kind of conversation around the so-called militarization by López Obrador, is that with the situation that happened in Culiacán with the son of El Chapo. So they caught him, and they had him in their custody.
Let's just bring it home for our viewers. Chapo Guzman.
Yes, and Chapo Guzman, Sinaloa cartel, one of the most notorious names in organized crime. So, his son was detained by Mexican state security forces, and obviously the cartel responded, and they have firepower. This is not just, a ragtag outfit. And they're like, we are going to burn this city down unless you hand him over. And I think a previous administration, had it been Enrique Peña Nieto, Felipe Calderón, they would have been like, bring it on. Let's have a war. Who cares about how many innocents are going to get slaughtered on the streets of a residential neighborhood, right? And López Obrador made a different decision and said, you know what? These big figures aren't our strategy. Our strategy is to attend to the root causes, right? And, the same progressive communities that talk about defunding the police, which is, the correct call inside of the United States, absolutely, are the ones who say that funding should go to social programs. That's what's happening here. It's literally an effort to try to attend to the root causes of violence. All those young people that similarly, as a result of the shift in the Mexican economy in the 90s, were left without employment or education. That they called them, they say here in Mexico, the only thing they gave them was a new nickname, the ninis, because they didn't give them anything else. So obviously, where are they going to go? They go into the hands of organized crime. So this idea that we're going to provide social supports, economic opportunities, so that they don't end up in the hands. And that's a strategy that obviously doesn't see the fruits 3 years in. It takes time to reduce that. There's also the efforts to actually freeze the accounts of the organized crime groups. That's something that even the United States has admitted is a good strategy that is proving useful, of actually weakening the financial power of these organized crime groups. But also, I would say to all of the listeners inside the United States, this is also a problem that is as a result of the demand that exists for these contraband goods and the flow of guns that come in to Mexico. So, this isn't a Mexican problem. It's not like Mexicans are uniquely violent. It's something that has a historical explanation that will require a sustained strategy. I will say at the very least, what we can say about the severe crimes in the country, that they haven't risen. So at least they're leveling off. And the hope is that eventually they'll start to curve downwards.
I think a lot of people in the U.S. don't understand. They think in terms of like taking out kingpins or like getting bin Laden. But I mean, the lesson of, for example, taking out Pablo Escobar by creating this proxy force, like the DEA was working through Los Pepes, this group they basically created out of his opponents, is that it made things worse on the ground. It caused more violence because the cartels were less organized. And then everybody was vying for power because the Los Pepes was like a fake thing. And it totally destabilized Medellin and Bogota. And in the 80s in Mexico, you had, what's his name? Quintero and Gallardo, the leaders of the Guadalajara cartel. That was like the big cartel. They were like doing lines with the president's staff. Like they were in the administration practically, because, I mean, maybe it's just my theory, but I think I understand how it works. They were a major source of liquidity for an administration that really wasn't trying to generate much of a tax base or doing anything. And they were like basically a de facto corporation. And you go to the north, and you just cross the border, from like Douglas, Arizona, and you'll see like these giant hotels surrounded by poverty. The hotels are run by narcos. They're like basically businessmen who are the only people bringing cash in. So it's very difficult to take that on. Calderon totally failed. You were referencing this militarized plan that the Bush administration and Alberto Gonzalez signed off on. I mean, it just created more violence, right? I mean, it many civilians and people who were just bystanders were killed. But what I could never figure out, I was in Veracruz in like 2013 or something, and you would see the, I don't know, it was the Navy or the Marines or something. They were in the street. It was heavily militarized, and people were like, yeah, those are the Zetas. Like they basically work for the Zetas. Like I could never make sense of what the cartels were doing and whether they'd penetrated the armed forces or not. Is there an issue of the cartels still having penetrated parts of government? How capable would they be of destabilizing this administration and even being used as a proxy force from the outside through another program like Fast and Furious, where basically I think what that program was about was actually arming one cartel against another from the US.
Yeah, one of the scary things is how much organized crime has been able to diversify where it's able to get its resources. And so it's not just through the sales of narcotics, right? It's owning hotels, it's owning businesses, it's charging derecho de piso, which is the right to kind of conduct economic activity in a given area. That's much harder to root out. It's something that Colombia went through and is still dealing with the fallout of it. And the point you made is absolutely correct. Part of the problem is that the previous strategy, all it did was splinter the leadership and create tons of little mini heads who were all interested in jockeying for power. So it's not something I certainly don't have an easy solution, but does organized crime still have that kind of power? Absolutely. And they are deeply, deeply wedded to a lot of the political apparatus, especially in the lower levels. So like the municipal and the state level. For example, in the state of Jalisco, it's said that that there's a de facto relationship between the governor there, Alfaro, and organized crime. And so it's not something that I think is going to be solved during López Obrador's term for sure. And so it's the kind of thing that also requires international cooperation and solidarity, but in kind of in a different sense, one that isn't the one that we've seen before, which kind of pushed for, like Plan Mérida, just more militarization, more use of the armed forces, the going after the kingpins. That doesn't work. And I'm hopeful that this strategy will.
Can I just quickly follow up on that? Because you mentioned Plan Merida. I mean, that was also involved a lot of officials in the Obama administration. And I mean, I haven't been following it closely enough. Are any of these officials who helped work on that plan in the Biden administration? And would that mean there's kind of a carryover of the relationship with Peña Nieto and the Mexican right into the Biden administration?
There's definitely a carryover in terms of like what the political apparatus inside of Mexico and who the connections that they have. The relationship with the United States is good. Mayorkas was just here. So
the DHS chief.
Yeah, exactly. But on the, publicly, we're all friends. Everything is fine. But there are some tensions. There was one really important initiative that López Obrador did, which was limiting the power of foreign agents inside of Mexican territory. They can't do what they used to be able to do. They can't, run freely with weapons and lead raids and using the Mexican security forces as cannon fodder. That's something that's now changed, and that kind of provokes the ire of these. But is this sort of the Plan Merida, Plan Colombia attitude still prevalent in U.S. foreign policy? Absolutely. It was Joe Biden himself who said, I was the architect of Plan Colombia. I was the one who wrote that. When that actually made the news here in Mexico, everyone's like, wow, this guy is not going to be much better if he's boasting about a failed strategy in Colombia. We're a country that's very much in a similar situation that Colombia was in that period, and that only made things worse. So if that's the plan that they're coming with, they're going to meet resistance, and they have, right? That's why we see these changes legislative in terms of what U.S. agents can actually do inside of Mexico.
Yeah, I just want to stress for people who don't follow Mexico super closely, who are listening to this, that Felipe Calderón, again, the viciously right-wing former close ally of George Bush, who launched the war on drugs in Mexico that led to over 100,000 deaths. He loves Joe Biden, and if you look at his Twitter account, I mean, and you can talk more about this, José Luis, but if you follow the kind of like neoliberal media elite in Mexico, they love Biden.
Yes. And
here's a tweet when Biden won the election. Felipe Calderón is congratulating him and posting photos with him. And then there's more of Obama. Felipe Calderón also on Twitter has praised Obama. He posted actually, I'm getting it up here for people who are watching. He tweeted out an image of Obama's biography, saying that right here, this is the tweet. Say, yesterday I got a great surprise, and I'm sharing with you. And it's A Promised Land by Obama. It's his biography. So like, this is a guy who, a former Mexican military general, admitted that he ran his own death squad. That was like a big scandal, I know, in Mexico for a while, that Felipe Calderón ran his own death squad. So, I mean, it just shows a lot that, and I remember when there was the election in the United States, that there was all this propaganda saying that Amlo's best friends with Trump, that Amlo's a right-winger and blah, blah, blah. I mean, it shows how much the Democrats are absolutely wedded to imperialism and intervention. And you mentioned that Biden has bragged about his role in Plan Colombia, and Max and I have both written articles of the Grayzone about what's called Plan Biden for Central America. It's the exact same kind of neoliberal plan to try to supposedly stabilize Central America, although whether or not they actually want to stabilize Central America, I think is actually up for debate. But we're already at an hour, so I want to ask a few final questions before we start to wrap up, and just kind of pivot back a little bit to Amlo and his administration. And specifically, we were talking off the call. Before the call, we were talking about his foreign minister and the foreign policy of Mexico, because I think if you compare the foreign policy of AMLO to past neoliberal governments, certainly it's a much better, less interventionist, I wouldn't say anti-imperialist, but a much more non-interventionist foreign policy. And especially, they're going back to this idea like the Estrada doctrine of non-intervention, which has a history, a legacy in Mexico of non-interference in foreign affairs of other countries. So we have seen that AMLO gave a speech in which he said that he would be willing to sell gasoline to Venezuela because Mexico is a sovereign country. It was a hint. He didn't mention sanctions, but it was a hint that he could potentially violate U.S. sanctions and help Venezuela. We have seen that Mexico has played a role in what's called the Puebla group, the Grupo de Puebla, which is this kind of collection of center-left governments in Latin America. But at the same time, to be fair, there are some critiques. So this week, we saw that the Mexican Foreign Ministry criticized Nicaragua, which detained these right-wing coup plotters who were behind the violent 2018 coup attempt. And the Mexican Foreign Ministry, and specifically the Foreign Minister, Marcelo Ebrard, criticized Nicaragua. So I'm curious if you can just kind of talk about Mexico's foreign policy under AMLO.
Yeah, absolutely. So with López Obrador, he's always been pretty hands-off when it comes to foreign policy. He's a person who thinks, that his priority needs to be domestic policy, and he has charged somebody who's always been very much a first mate to him, a second in command, with leading the foreign policy of Mexico. But nonetheless, what López Obrador has been able to do on the international scene is pretty admirable. Like you said, it surprised many that he was able to get along with Trump. That's a really important relationship. We talked about this earlier in the program. The U.S. is the most important economic partner, and he managed to keep Trump at bay. That really says a lot. And now with Biden, which I think has an administration that is far more interested in interfering inside of Mexican affairs, things seem to be going well. Like we said, we had Kamala Harris, we had Mayorkas, and so the relationship is fine, and that's due to the statecraft of López Obrador. But to talk a little bit more specifically about the foreign policy, I actually made this question for Álvaro García Linera. I was like, so López Obrador has never used the words anti-imperialist, but effectively he has been, right? He sent a plane to go rescue you. He's oriented his policy towards the global south. Does that make him an anti-imperialist? And his answer was, it doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, he is. And that's what's important, right? Mexico's foreign policy is one that's very much in line with the anti-imperialist wave that is taken in America, and that's really important. And it's why I mentioned the vaccine program. I've seen the cooperation with Central American countries. What I just mentioned about not recognizing the coup in Bolivia. I would say one other thing. One of the things that I think really helped when there was that coup attempt in Venezuela to try to name Juan Guaidó as the interim president, one of the strategies was clear, look at all these Latin American countries, Colombia, Brazil, Chile, they're all recognizing, and it was Mexico who said, we're not. And that kind of froze the momentum of that. It was like, oh, so this isn't like a done deal. This is actually something that's in dispute. And I think that really helped a lot of countries, especially those outside of Latin America, to be like, well, no, we have relations with Nicolás Maduro's government, so we're going to continue to recognize them. And if you look, they love saying, oh, 40 countries recognize Guaidó. It's not, there's, 190 something countries in the world that recognize in the United Nations, and the vast majority recognize Maduro. So I think that was a really important thing. So anyway, to go back to Ebrard. So I mentioned this before we started. Ebrard is a great first mate, and everybody here says that. He does a really good job. But as soon as he has the power in his own hands, he starts that rightward drift. And so that's why on files like, for example, Nicaragua, it's also worth noting that a lot of sort of the Nicaraguan dissidents have long-standing relationships with people inside Mexico. There are many of them in Mexico. Some of the people that were ultimately arrested were actually doing a bit of a media push right beforehand. And so that's, I think, helps explain a little bit why Mexico ended up taking that position. But it's something that's going to become increasingly important depending on how high somebody like Marcelo Ebrard's star rises. Is he going to be López Obrador's successor? Right now, it looks increasingly like he won't be. But if he is, I do think that would represent a rightward shift of the movement. And just to tie it all back to the elections, which is the reason I decided to come. You invited me here on the program. Morena as a party is in a bad state. And I think we should be honest about that. It is a party that has, in a lot of ways, transformed into everything that it fought against, in the sense that the leadership controls everything. The leadership makes backroom deals. They're inviting these, unscrupulous actors into the coalition, and they're leaving the bases outside. Morena was founded as a movement. It was founded as something that was meant to always invigorate the bases. That's largely been lost. But they haven't disappeared. They're still there. And it's these same bases that continue to support and that turned out to vote, for example, but that they're clamoring for more space inside of the party to try to agitate so that they have more of a voice. And I think that's going to become increasingly important. There's already discussions happening now, like what has to be done. There was just a piece by a writer in La Jornada talking especially about this. What is going to happen with these bases? Where are they going to be able to break through the control that the leadership, people like Mario Delgado, who's the president of Morena, have over the party? And the hope is yes. And it's something that the party knows is important. Way back, they decided that they were going to dedicate half of the resources that they get, the state subsidy for the party, to the political education school. There was this really big dream about what it was going to be. Unfortunately, what did that do? That made a lot of people in the positions of power fear that this was going to become a parallel power to them. So they denied it resources. And to this day, we're in 2021, June 2021, and the institute largely doesn't exist. And that's a shame. And that needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed quickly because the next elections are not that far away. And unless the bases are activated, all it's going to do is give more power to the Mario Delgados, to the Marcelo Ebrads of the party to do their backroom deals and lose the support of the bases, right? That's the thing, is that the bases of Morena, like the bases of PSUV, like the bases of Alianza País, are the people who are there to save you when the crisis comes, right? And so that's one thing that I really hope listeners now will also pay attention to. I know it's kind of boring inside party politics, but I think it's some of the things that historically the pink tide has made mistakes. Ecuador as an example. Ecuador similarly didn't put enough attention into developing the political level of its cadre, and that's how you get Lenin Morenos. And so the hope is that's something that changes soon.
Are we wrapping? Because if so, I have one kind of last question for both of you.
Yeah, well, I have one as well, but go ahead, Max.
Why don't you ask yours, and then because mine is more like of a sweeping, epic question. Great.
Well, just for my final question here, looking forward, and you kind of acknowledge this by talking about Marcelo Ebrard, the canciller, the foreign minister, and there are other figures who are being discussed for a potential successor to AMLO. And for a lot of people who don't follow Mexican politics closely, that might be kind of surprising because they think, well, wait, AMLO just entered office. But what's not well known is that Mexico actually has a one-term limit on their presidents. And, we talked about figures like Lázaro Cárdenas, who for AMLO is a kind of political model, a kind of idol. He's called himself a Cardenista, and this represents the kind of left-wing nationalist strain in Mexican politics. But at the same time, Mexico is very much a kind of small d Democrat. And I've talked with a lot of friends in Mexico who are part of Morena and the social movements who support AMLO. And I've asked them this many times. I'm like, well, why don't they try to rewrite the Constitution? I'm not saying that he should be president for life, but maybe like at least one other term. But, they often tell me that, no, he very much believes in the Mexican political system and that AMLO would not do a constitutional convention to try to have another term. He's very likely he's just going to leave after his first term, and he'll remain like a kind of symbolic political leader, but not president. So can you just comment on that really quickly? Why do you think that is? And if he is going to truly leave in 2024, which looks very likely, are there other people who can kind of fill his shoes? Because, he's a figure you mentioned who's been running for president multiple times. He won the 2006 election, and he famously said, after the subsequent election that he won, he famously said that he was the real rightful president. And some Mexicans, working class Mexicans, recognized him as the rightful leader. He occupies this very large place in the Mexican left. So without imagining just one term, what could follow?
Yeah, he's definitely not going to run again. Actually, this morning they talked about the constitutional reforms that they do want to implement, and it's one's around the National Electoral Authority, another one is around the National Guard, and another one related to the National Electricity Company. So if he was thinking about it, he probably would have mentioned it now. It's a long drawn-out process. Like I said, you have to have 2/3 of Congress, but also local Congresses have to approve it as well. It's not going to happen. He's probably not going to run. It's slim to none, the possibilities of that. And it's going to be a pretty significant setback for Morena. There isn't a figure like López Obrador. López Obrador has been a figure in Mexican politics since he was assaulted by security forces in Tabasco, when he was protesting in his home state. And so, he's been a very prominent figure. Obviously he ran 3 times for the presidency. He was a major leader in the efforts to stop the privatization of Pemex. And so, his absence is going to present a pretty serious challenge to the party, which is, again, another reason why they need to turn back to the bases. As to why, why is he like this? Yeah, he said he's a Cardenista. He also calls himself a Juarista. He really does invoke a lot of Mexican history in his own. He's trying to, position himself as an agent of Mexican history. His political process here, we call it La Cuarta Transformación, the fourth transformation. So what was the first? The independence. There was the reform. There was the revolution. What was the revolution? It was an effort to stop the re-election of Porfirio Diaz, initially. And so these kinds of principles are deeply ingrained in his own political thought. So that's why you won't see him make this push. And he says, I want to be remembered as a good president. And I think he's a little bit worried that if he overstays his welcome, that he won't be remembered that way. So what does that leave us? It leaves us, a number of high profile, like I mentioned already, Marcelo Ebrard. There's also Ricardo Monreal, who's very similar. It's a kind of backroom deal, political operator. And then there's Claudia Sheinbaum, who's the head of government here in Mexico City right now. It's difficult to say if, who is going to be and what the process is going to be. There is a tradition in Mexico that the outgoing president selects his successor. We call it the dedazo. It's quite possible that'll play out again. But again, if there is more of a push from the grassroots, my personal hope would be that there's actually a primary process, so that there's actually a debate of ideas in terms of like what's next. When I talk to my friends about Mexico, I always tell them that this is not going to take 1 6-year term. It's going to take several. And this is the beginning of a much deeper transformation. But the point is that people like me need to be on the ground agitating for the movement, for the orientation to be towards the left. And I also mentioned that to all the people who think, from behind their computers, on their Twitter accounts, that it's their job to critique from the left governments like López Obrador's. It's really quite arrogant. There are leftists inside the country. We are engaging in that discussion and in that struggle here as well. It's pretty rude of them to think that that's not happening, that we're all just a bunch of automatons following the dictates of the leader. Of course, that these same discussions that are happening on social media in English are also happening on the streets and in people's apartments and in political meetings here in Spanish as well. And I think that we deserve a little bit more respect in that regard, that we're going to also push to profundizar, to deepen this process.
Well, the nation pronounced López Obrador a great disappointment in its only article about the election, but they will never utter a bad word about Bernie Sanders, who's never held executive power in a government, never had to take responsibility for executive level decisions. Talking about him is forbidden. So, I
just want to point out really quickly, Max, it's really funny. The nation declared him, and specifically Don Paley, again, this U.S. academic who whitewashed the coup in Bolivia, declared AMLO to be a great disappointment for Mexicans. And then days later, Mexicans a majority of Mexicans voted in support of AMLO and his political alliance. So that by definition means that a majority of Mexicans are not disappointed with AMLO.
Or they just like being disappointed. I mean,
that's right, because we don't know what else to do, right?
I'm from a Jewish family, and we kind of like have learned to just accept that, and but I don't know. I don't think that.
But here's the funny thing about those kinds of critiques. The same thing we saw from The Economist and all of that is that what did that end up feeding? It ended up feeding into the defeat of Morena in Mexico City, right? So maybe they didn't vote for the opposition, but a lot of people that consider themselves progressive but are middle class stayed home. I mentioned this again. There was these really rude images of like the city divided in two. But if you actually looked in, if you zoomed into the actual boroughs of Mexico City, you would see, well, the rich colonias, the middle class colonias voted for the opposition, and the working class communities voted for Morena, right? So there is still that support. All you did was help feed the trolls that use it and amplify it in order to trick the middle class into voting against the ruling party. It's a classical dilemma, but.
And I just want to point out, because this, for people who don't follow Mexican politics, that map you're talking about was this really crude classist meme going around on Twitter showing one half of Mexico City where the rich live, and it says that these people work, and then the other half where the Morena-led alliance won, the left alliance, where the majority of working class people live, and it says these people don't work, they're on like welfare or whatever. And AMLO himself actually addressed that meme, that disgusting cartoon, in one of his morning press conferences, the Mañanera, and condemned it for being classist. So, I mean, it really shows the classism in Mexico is just so, and the racism, which is very similar because many of the elites are light-skinned and have European last names, but it's just so blatant in Mexican politics.
Yeah, they're the white wealthy Mexicans that I've met. It's like it really is like, it's like the perfect blend of like Trump and Jared and Ivanka. It's like they present like Jared and Ivanka with like blow dried hair, and they look like they're going to the country club, and they just have these filthy, racist, sneering attitudes of Trump. So, perfect way of playing off the resentment of the majority of Mexicans is to point to the opposition's critiques of you. And, we were, I think, attacked in passing at the Grayzone in The Economist. And it was like the greatest thing. I was like, thank you. I want to be attacked by The Economist. Like, that's like a badge of honor. And I think, it would be the same for any quote unquote populist candidate in Latin America. And speaking of a nationalist, progressive candidate who has won, who's succeeded, although I don't know if the U.S. has recognized him yet, is Pedro Castillo. And so I wanted to kind of close with this very hopeful victory against a far-right candidate, someone of the extreme right, a dictator's daughter, Keiko Fujimori, who says that she cannot accept defeat because of communism, and there's this tidal wave of anti-communism. But the hope is not just for Peru, but for the continent and the region. And I see a lot of people on social media invoking a new pink tide. I don't know if I would go that far. What I see happening could be potentially a pink wall, where these social democratic presidents are able to actually defend countries like Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela that are the real targets, and allow a kind of regional transformation and the revival of the ALBA as an economic alternative to the Inter-American Development Bank, that kind of thing. But what do you all think, starting with José Luis, and if we can keep it somewhat brief, just because I got to be out soon. Are we seeing a new pink tide?
I think rhetorically, if it works, if it inspires people, absolutely call it that, But one thing I would say is that it's not like the working class campesino movements went anywhere. We suffer defeats, you regroup, and you come back. And that's what we're seeing in Peru. It's what we're seeing in Chile. It's what we're seeing in Colombia. Imagine Colombia is, we call it the Israel of Latin America. It's the outpost of U.S. imperialism, and never has Uribismo, which is the far right, been so weak And it's thanks to the bravery, the resilience of movements, right? There have been consistent national stoppages in Colombia, but this one turned into a social uprising. Why? Because their work has been done, because, they tapped into a real mood. And so I think that we're on the cusp of something very interesting. If we want to call it a pink tide, that's fine. It helps us feel more united. It makes sense to me. But I think it's also important that people understand that one of the primary contradictions in Latin America continues to be imperialism. And one of the greatest threats to success of progressive social policies in not just Latin America, but all of the Americas, and I include Canada and the United States in that, is the ability for countries to develop their policies independently and to show that they can be successful, so that working class people inside the United States as well can be like, we want this. Why, how is it possible that they can have it, that their movements aren't sucked up by a liberal party and then dismantled, but actually deliver results? And so that kind of people to people unity, I think, is really, really important. And I hope that this is the beginning of that.
I think that's the perfect note to end on. I mean, Max, just because he addressed it to me as well, I just briefly will say that, yeah, I think we can call it a new pink tide. I mean, as José Luis would know better than me, people in Latin America don't even really use the term pink tide. That's an English language term. But, I think it is true that we're seeing the return of this left-wing surge, and it's not necessarily the same. It has a different character, but we need to stress that, Pedro Castillo, who comes from a socialist, in fact, a Marxist-Leninist party, just won the presidency in Peru, and the far-right candidate's trying to steal it, but it's clear that he won. And that, in a country like Peru, which was actually kind of left out of the pink tide in the past 20 years, that's extremely important. And then also, as we'll be covering here at Moderate Rebels in the Grayzone, this year there's a presidential election in Chile, which is going to be massive, extremely important in November. And right now, according to the polls, the number one candidate is a Palestinian communist, Daniel Jadue, from the Communist Party of Chile. So we'll see what happens there. A lot could change before November, but that is extremely significant. And then, of course, as José Luis mentioned, even in Colombia, with the massive uprising against austerity and neoliberal policies, and the upcoming presidential election there in just a year, we see that it's likely that the kind of center-left candidate, Gustavo Petro, might win. I mean, he actually says that he won, and it's likely that he did win and that it was actually stolen from him, which, is very likely because Colombia is extremely corrupt. And we know that Iván Duque, the far-right current president, he bought votes using drug money. So I mean, we'll talk more about that at the Grayzone and Moderate Rebels. And in fact, I was going to mention, to conclude here, that in a few days, Max and I will be speaking with Daniel Espinosa, probably. He just wrote a really good article at the Grayzone about Peru. He's a Peruvian journalist, and he talked about the situation with Pedro Castillo. We wanted to do an episode on that, but of course, the results are not clear yet. So we're still waiting to figure out when is the best time to do an episode. But we just want to thank, right now, we are joined by José Luis Granados Ceja. José Luis, we want to thank you so much for joining us. It was a great discussion. Just to go out here, do you want to plug anything?
Follow me on Twitter. It's where I'm most active. It's at GRANADOSCEJA, my two last names. And I'm more than happy to engage in conversations and answer questions. Really glad we had an hour and a half to talk. It's not often you get this opportunity. But if there's anything else that maybe I didn't cover, more than happy to talk with people, and also continue to support the work of the Grayzone. It's one of the most important anti-imperialist voices out there in the English-speaking world. And it's good to know that we can count on allies.
Thanks a lot, José Luis. Keep up the great work.
Excellent. All right. Well, for people who are watching, this is his Twitter. Definitely follow him at Granados Ceja. And if you want to support our show, you can go to patreon.com/Moderate Rebels. And I also mentioned earlier that José Luis is a staff writer at Venezuela Analysis. That's another website that people can definitely support. They're good friends of ours and part of this small group of anti-imperialist independent media. So with that, thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you all next time.